Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. For those of you who just joined, welcome to our show. What we'll be talking about today, as you can see, is how to build an effective portfolio and get hired in 2025 and what has changed. We have invited an awesome guest back for like a third time or fourth time. So everyone loves Earl and usually get amazing feedback. So we'd love to have Earl back. So he is, and we'll introduce him in a second. He's a seasoned UX professional, has a ton of experience in the field, he has hired many people as well, and we'll share lots of insights on this with you and answer any questions. We'll introduce our wonderful guest in just a few minutes. For those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Michael, and I'm the founder of a company called BeginX. We help people who know UX basics and want to transition into UX. Our program is a part-time UX career accelerator with real mission-driven client projects that provides a guaranteed way to become highly marketable and land a UX role. And unlike most traditional bootcamps or career programs, we allow our participants to build real experience, draw real client portfolio, crucial soft UX skills like UX team collaboration, client and stakeholder management, presentation, etc., and master the UX job search and interviewing necessary to actually land the UX role. And all in a collaborative and fun environment, right? And under the guidance of industry practitioner mentors from top companies. And I don't mean this to brag or anything like that, but just want to give you a bit of a background for credibility purposes. The company is headquartered in New York City, and we have run many virtual cohorts and helped around 160 people or so get hired into UX roles. We'll tell you a bit more about our virtual program and also make a special announcement closer to the end of the event. Of course, that part is completely optional for you. All right. So next slide here. So here are just some of the companies that the grads were hired by. So we've seen lots of people go through this entire UX career transition, essentially. So essentially, what I wanted to also mention to you today, right, is one of our key principles specifically, right, is starting with the end in mind. So before diving into things and starting to spend lots of time on learning and doing, it's key to understand what exactly is needed to become that candidate that employers will actually want to hire, and then how you will actually get there. So, and by the way, if anyone is confused, I'm not sharing any slides at the moment. I know some people asked last time. So just to cover a few quick concepts and then hand it over to Earl in a couple of minutes. So first of all, there are three main key roadblock areas that prevent people from successfully transitioning into the field and landing their first UX job. One is lack of solid hard and soft skills that they can successfully demonstrate in their resume and portfolio. Two, lack of strong portfolio case studies and real experience. And three, weak job search assets and poor search as well as interviewing skills. So let's address these one by one. Here's a high-level framework of what is needed that many people like and find quite useful. We use a product analogy in this framework, so you'll understand why soon. Kind of goes back to what I showed you earlier. So you want to have strong hard skills, right? Essentially knowledge and hands-on practice with the key phases of the UX process and ability to produce the deliverables. Softer skills is the next area. You want to have hands-on practice and experience with the key soft skills in a UX setting that can be included on resume, portfolio, and then demonstrated in interviews, such as team collaboration, client management, presentation, communication, that you can actually show in your resume and portfolio. And this can sometimes be even more important than the hard skills and is listed on almost any job description that you look at. The next area is case studies. So comprehensive, sizable UX projects. And unlike in visual design, for example, effective UX case studies are typically much longer and more comprehensive. So the focus is more on the process, right? Definitely not on the quantity of those. So typically you need at least like 3 to maybe 5 sizable case studies. We usually recommend having 2 of those with real clients so you can have a competitive advantage compared to other folks transitioning into the field. The next area is real experience, and this requirement is also listed on almost any job description, even entry-level ones, and this is usually the most important criteria for many employers. So here are some tips specifically, since we're going to be talking about portfolios today and case studies, right? So here are some tips related to building that real experience and case studies to ensure that the real work of projects that you do actually turn into strong and effective UX case studies and valuable work experience. First of all, you want to have more unique and not cookie cutter projects included in like lots of other candidates' portfolios. You want to have engaged and collaborative clients to work with who are interested in and committed to the project, right? So it sounds simple, but yeah, it can be just first like great initial filter. So you actually have a good experience and strong case studies afterward. You want to have an opportunity to regularly interact and collaborate with the clients and the key stakeholder, because that is like a crucial competency for you to build and then later to demonstrate to employers. Ideally, you want to have digital product experience. So not just information sites, ideally, but more of like a mobile app or web app or essentially some type of software. You want to do these projects in a team setting as much as possible, because that will be crucial to demonstrate to employers. As you can see, that skill and capability is listed on almost any job description that you look at. So you will want to be able to prove and demonstrate it. Ideally, you want to have a mentor, right, to ensure that you do not waste time and that you're on track. Because let's say if you're brand new and you're starting out and maybe you're doing some volunteering for some great organization or something like that, or a startup, right? And maybe they're not experts at UX either. So you put two and two together, and it's very easy to have a long, drawn out and painful experience. So a mentor can really help you guide you in the right direction. You want to plan, structure, and scope the project with the client in advance to ensure you move in the right direction and the project is sizable, but you actually get it done in a couple of 3 months or so maybe, and it does not drag on forever, right? So this will help ensure that you actually gain valuable experience, but in a timely manner, and have strong portfolio case studies afterwards. Another very important point is implementation and tension, right? So essentially you want to have access to the executive team and key decision makers and ensure that they really want to get this done, right? So it's not just some like nice to have for them, but they really want to get this done, because that will maximize the probability that the work that you do will actually be implemented. You can never guarantee that, but you want to maximize the probability. And in that case, you may be able to actually showcase the impact and the result, which will look much better on your portfolio. You also want to ensure that you can actually showcase your work in your portfolio. Again, sounds simple, but we get asked this question all the time, and there are often like NDAs preventing this. So an NDA is okay, but as long as it does not preclude you from showcasing the work that you've done in your portfolio. And also you want to have some developer handoff experience or developer collaboration experience, and ideally involve a developer earlier on in the process. So essentially, hard skills, soft skills, case studies, and experience, it's like a product or a service that you're building and will be offering to employers. Next, you want to create the search assets, as we call them, to showcase your product. That involves your effective UX portfolio. So you want to receive plenty of feedback from UX industry professionals and iterate many, many times. You want to have a strong UX resume and key online presence like LinkedIn, etc., with that professional UX experience, and then also iterate many times based on receiving lots of feedback from industry practitioners. So essentially, you need to package all of your skills and experience effectively and position yourself as a candidate that employers really want to hire. So someone they can see can hit the ground running and help them solve some of their problems. So someone who does not require a ton of training, a ton of investment from them, because the budgets are tight, basically. You also want to understand and master effective strategies in the UX-specific interviewing process. So you want to build relationships with many professional contacts in the UX space, and then also get lots of practice and experience with the UX interviewing process by conducting mock interviews and special exercises, whiteboarding challenges, portfolio presentations. And basically, this will help ensure that, first of all, you start getting interview invites, and second, that you do not waste those opportunities, but you can actually effectively progress to next rounds and then get job offers as well. So we refer to job search assets, search itself, and interviewing as marketing and selling of that product that you've built. The biggest mistake that we see typically is just not building a product that is strong enough. And if you don't do that, You can do all the marketing and selling that you want, but it's just not going to be very effective, right? You're just going to get, you will get some rejection in the process anyway, but if you don't build a great product, you'll get much more rejection and frustration in the process, right? Which can get quite demotivating and kind of risk and compromise your whole career transition. The other big mistake is not learning the science behind marketing and sales, not preparing and practicing in that area enough. And in that case, even if you have a decent product, right, if you don't master that marketing and selling phase, you can still get stuck in that phase for months or even years. All right, so this is just a quick intro to show you and give you the big picture model, right? So now we'll zoom in more into the actual portfolios and case studies. And I'm really excited to pass it over to Earl. And so we finally got to the most fun part, and I'd love to introduce our awesome guest, and then we'll jump into the talk and then the interview afterwards as well. So Earl, great to have you here. Thanks again for joining us. I'm really excited to have the discussion with you again. And I know you're the experts on this, right? So really awesome to have you here. Would you like to briefly introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure, yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me back. I love coming back and seeing all prospective designers, current designers, future designers. It's been great. I'm happy to give you a quick intro. So I'm Earl. I work at Google. I've been at Google for about 6.5 years. I currently lead a bunch of areas within Android and Pixel. So those are like phones, tablets, foldables now, watches. We do the whole kind of ecosystem. During, my first 3 years at Google, I led Gmail. So I've been, working on communication products for a long time. And before that, I've had a career in a lot of different industries. I've been in UX for about 20 years, and I've worked in travel, entertainment, healthcare, fintech, computer networking randomly, you name it, B2B, B2B2C, B2B2B, B2C, all of the B2Cs. And so, yeah, I've been around the block, and more importantly, I've been a hiring manager for quite some time. So I've been looking at portfolios probably for the last 15 years, doing lots of hiring for these companies. And so I would love to share, some of the things we look for in portfolios, some of the things I look for in portfolios, and talk a little more about that. I prepared a couple of slides. Do you want me to share some of those and we can just kind of dive in?
Oh yeah,
Great,
definitely.
great. Let's do this. Great. Um, let's do that. Okay, so gave my quick intro, but I did want to say my career path into UX has been really windy. I think most people's career paths have been very windy. And I think UX is kind of that type of field where it's at the intersection of a lot of different other fields. For me personally, I started off as a sound designer. I did some like beeps and clicks and ringtones for BlackBerry, which then evolved into like motion design, which then eventually brought me to UX design. And I changed programs. I was doing computer science, and then I did fine arts, and then I did HCI. So lots of changes in the last 15 to 20 years. But like most designers, I think that makes me a much stronger, more well-rounded designer. And so I'm also a mentor, which is really fun. I get to meet people from all around the world and help them either break into UX or continue their careers in UX, get promoted, grow. And it's a little different than coaching. Coaching tends to be from somebody who's, not as specialized in that area. And so I'm a mentor. I focus on UX, and I help with, helping people land their next job or growing in their current role. And my website is uxmentor.net if you want to check it out. And so, what we're going to talk about today is the hiring pipeline, and specifically within the hiring pipeline, the role of website portfolios and portfolio presentations. Website portfolios are literally the number one way for folks to get their foot in the door, to get that first hiring call with HR. And so it's really, really, really important to remember that your portfolio initially isn't actually reviewed by a designer. It's almost always reviewed by a recruiter or HR. And so when you think about your website portfolio, definitely think about, designing it for somebody who's not specialized in this space, who is hiring for a bunch of different roles at a bunch of different times. And so they essentially, what they do is they HR shortlists candidates that they think are strong, and then they send that shortlist to a hiring manager like me. And so what you want to make sure is that you get your name on that shortlist by really, really, really impressing them with your website portfolio. And we'll talk a little more about how to impress HR and recruitment. So yeah, just remember your initial audience is a recruiter. It's not a design manager. And again, as UX professionals, right, our job is to always be thinking about our users, our audience. And so when you're designing your own artifacts, make sure you're thinking about your audience. So put yourself in a recruiter's shoe or an HR person's shoe. They're reviewing and shortlisting, they could be going through 300 portfolios per position. And so they're going through portfolios really, really quickly. They're going through resumes really, really quickly. I've seen stats that they spend roughly about 30 seconds. I've been with some recruiters that spend 15 seconds. And so what you're really, really, really designing for is your portfolio to be scannable, meaning easily digestible in about a 15-second time period where they just scroll, they see kind of the breadth of your work, the depth of your work, and go from there. And so since they're reviewing this like very high volume of case studies, HR recruiters, they tend to rarely read through the case study, but they do scan through your work. And so one thing you might want to kind of think about is like, how do I design my homepage and my website case study to be super scannable? And usually the way to do that is almost like designing a magazine, right? You want to design with headings, subheadings, sub-subheadings, bullets, large graphics, large visuals. And one test you can do is basically just do the scroll test, right? Scroll through your portfolio, just read the headings, look at the visual artifacts, and see if you can get like a gist of kind of what the case study is about. If you can't get a gist of it, then you probably need to go back to the drawing board and redesign the reading experience. So at most, HR recruiters, they tend to look at one case study, maybe two. Their time is very limited. They tend to look at like the case study that's like at the top of your website. So you want to make sure that that first case study is like your best one, your most impactful one, with the expectation that they might not read anything else. Okay, so how can your portfolio stand out? It's not just about making it scannable, right? That's kind of like the bare minimum. I'm going to go through about 5 different tips. And Michael mentioned a lot of other really great ones, but I'll go through kind of my top 5 tips that I think will help. And we'll just talk about it. And feel free to leave questions. Happy to answer anything. But let's just go from there. So number one, maybe this is kind of maybe it's a given, but you need case studies that are real. Case studies that are conceptual or theoretical tend to not meet the bar anymore with recruiters or HR professionals, just because we can't get a sense of the real demands that you would take on during a project, right? It might show, with a theoretical project, it might show some of your design skills, it might show some of your process, but it doesn't really show the challenges you've worked through. It doesn't show stakeholder management, adaptability, all those soft, squishy skills that we like to see. So really what we want to see in a portfolio is practical, hands-on case studies. On top of that, right, as we're building out real case studies, right, we kind of look for some of these things. So we look for a unique UX process, right? We don't want to see just a generic process that is blindly followed. We want to see a process that really makes sense for the type of problems that you're trying to solve for the project. We want to see also all the messiness in this project, all the messy context. I don't want to see just the happy path that you started at point A and got to point B. I want to mostly hear about the hard parts. So really try to focus on the big challenges in the project. That helps me understand your critical thinking skills. It helps me understand your independence as a designer. It helps me understand hey, can I give this person something independently and they could just figure it out? I could be maybe very vague about the problem and they can just figure out what the real problem is to solve and solve it. That's kind of what we're looking for, is this strong critical thinking. Finally, this probably goes without saying also, but we want to see really awesome, interesting solutions, interesting problems, interesting solutions. Too often we'll see very kind of maybe mediocre problems or mediocre solutions. And that's typically because the designer, and it's usually, it's usually project selection that has to do with it. So it's usually that the designer maybe hasn't found a great project to work on or a great fit. And so one thing to look out for is, like, when you're selecting a project or trying to work on a project, really try to work on a project where the experience is targeted for a unique population. And that's kind of the key. Sometimes the more narrow the population you design for produces kind of the more interesting case studies. So you might not want a case study where you're designing for everyone, right? Where you're designing an app for food delivery or for cycling or tourism. You might want to design for, I don't know, let's just say, take the example of tourism. You might want to design for a specific kind of tourist, or you might want to design for a specific type of cyclist. But even better, if the population is even more unique, right? Maybe it's, like I said earlier, for a computer network engineer, you're designing a tool for them. That usually ends up being like a more interesting case study. So think about like the population you're designing for in the case study, and try to think about narrowing it down to a really, really interesting population. Um, so if you don't have real world projects, and I get this question a lot, like, what can I do? I don't have that many real world projects, or I don't have like high quality projects. So number one, you can roll in a boot camp like BeginX, which pairs you with real world clients. I always suggest, that's kind of like a shortcut, because then you don't have to try and source your own projects, which can take some time. You can also work with mentors who pair you with volunteering opportunities. So I pair all my mentees up with really interesting, great projects. You could also just try and advertise yourself on LinkedIn, on different Slack channels, to try and get a project of your own, right? And try to take on some more volunteer opportunities. And sometimes, you could also do a hackathon. I wouldn't say a hackathon makes like a great case study, but it tends to help you get other opportunities later on. So you can do like initially like a hackathon, and then the hackathon might lead to a 12-week volunteer project. So those are just some of the ways to get projects. But you can use your network, you can leverage your friends and family, that sort of thing as well. Okay, so sourcing high quality projects, we talked about real projects, not theoretical. Ideally, these are features that you work on that are shipped versus not shipped. I always recommend trying to work on projects where it's basically a two-way interaction between the user and the system and the app. Marketing websites are not great UX projects unless you're planning to go into website design for UX. Better projects are basically interactive products like apps, whether it's mobile or web apps, something that where a user keeps coming back and uses it on a weekly or monthly basis. So you really, really want to think about digital products, two-way interactions where there's like some back and forth. Also, in terms of a project, you want to typically focus on the most important parts of that app that really advance the goals of the business. So onboarding journeys, they tend not to be like the most effective case studies because usually you're just kind of copying patterns that already exist and applying it to a product. But what we really want is features that are core to that user journey that add value to that product. So think about, am I adding value to this app? What value am I adding? And finally, we also want more strategic projects over visual projects. So if you're going into UX visual design, that's maybe a little different story. But if you're going into a UX role or a product design role, visual design tends to be a component of that, but it's not the only thing. And so in your case study, you don't want to make a visual refresh kind of the only thing you feature. You really, really want to show some sort of strategic addition you made to that app or to that business. So those are like just some guidelines. Be really picky about which projects you take on. I know it's easier said than done, but don't just take everything that comes your way. Take on ones that will really add value and really show off your critical thinking skills. All right, so we talked about real projects. The next thing, narrowing in a little here, is on building a portfolio with a focus. So I tend to see a lot of portfolios that have like all different kinds of projects and maybe too many projects. And so for a hiring manager, it's really hard for us to like remember, okay, like what is this person about? Are they like a healthcare UX designer? Are they a consumer designer? Are they a B2B designer? So when you start curating your projects and putting them together, start weeding out ones that don't build a focus and put in ones that build a focus. Um, I always tend to try and encourage folks to focus on a couple of industries that they're targeting. I think a very targeted job search strategy is better than a general job search strategy. So you should think about, okay, like what industries have I already been in? What, like, even when you maybe weren't in UX before, what were your past careers? How do you leverage those? And then from there, think about those industries and really, really targeting those and having case studies for those specific industries. Um, Kind of in these days, especially with UX and tech being more challenging fields right now, we tend to hire people that already have experience in that sector or area. So for instance, a hiring manager who's, let's just say, hiring in fintech, they tend to already look for people who have fintech case studies, who have already maybe worked in fintech. It could have been in a non-UX role, but still have some experience in that space. So think about, okay, like what industries can I target? Do I want to go all in on one industry? Do I want to spread myself across two or three? So I have this like example of like two designers that have built a portfolio. Designer A targets an industry, designer B blasts their resume and portfolio at every industry. And so here is like the kind of typical example. Stephanie, she used to work in a pharmacy. She's now transitioning into UX, and this is actually one of my mentees, but different name. And so her old job strategy was throwing in a couple student projects, applying to as many jobs as possible, doing some one-time coffee chats. This totally didn't work. She kept applying. I think she applied to over 300 jobs. This totally didn't work. And so when when you realize, okay, like I've applied to like hundreds of jobs, this is not working, right? It's time to change your strategy. So the new strategy for Stephanie was to leverage her background as a pharmacy tech. She has a lot of experience in healthcare, right? She built her case study, her new portfolio around healthcare case studies. We did one around specifically a pharmacy tool, another around like a health tech tool, another like device. And so she built a case study as like being a healthcare UX designer. She built relationships with health tech hiring managers through LinkedIn, through meetups, through cold emails, through networking. And then her entire search focused on getting into healthcare. And that was like a winning strategy. She beat out all the candidates by far who applied because she had the most experience in healthcare. So that's kind of like one example, but there's many other examples like this. And so think about like what sectors you can target and try to kind of make the most of that. All right, so we're on to tip number 3, which is about having the right balance between visuals in your case study and process. And a lot of people mess this up because it's not obvious. Some people lean way too much on process, some lean only on visuals. And so, like, even hiring managers have kind of like different preferences. Like some kind of want to see more like the end results and more of the end results, and others want to see more of the inner workings. So my advice is like to cater to kind of all different hiring managers, try to balance visuals with process. Um, Remember what I said earlier, that usually it's like an HR or recruiter that initially looks at your portfolio. What typically happens is when they do kind of that scan, that first scan test, beautiful visuals, like they always catch that recruiter's eye, right? Like really nice UI, big bold UI, interesting UI. That usually catches their eye enough to sometimes land you on like a short list, which they'll pass on to a hiring manager. And so you do want to take advantage. We call it like the aesthetic bias, which is like the bias of recruiters and HRs to value aesthetics and think, oh, this person's like a great visual designer. They must be very good UX designer. So you want to kind of like take advantage of that first impression and that aesthetic bias and really, really have like nice, beautiful UI to showcase. Make sure you only show the deliverables you're proud of. I know we have so many projects where we're constrained by awful design systems. The client has a design system that looks like it's from 2005, and that's how we had to design things. It's fine, but what we want to show is design intent, right? And so what you want to do is show, if you didn't have all these constraints, what would it look like? And can you push that client's vision? Can you show me that you pushed on that vision to show me design intent of how this feature or product should be realized? And so in your case study, you do want to show beyond the constraints of a design system, beyond the constraints of a client, what you're capable of. And so I do want to see beautiful UI regardless of, what you're constrained with. So make sure you're showing deliverables that you feel you're proud of, that are beautiful, that really, really, really communicate a strong UI, a strong design vision. Some people recreate their artifacts, recreate their deliverables for their case study. I personally love doing that because you are doing communication design essentially with a case study. You are showing the best possible artifacts, the best possible story to go along with your case study. So I always recommend going back to your UI, going back to your mind maps, going back to your diagrams, whatever it is, and recreating the artifact to communicate an idea, right? And so that's what you really do want to do in your portfolio. I think I mentioned this before. You want to use large images, large visuals. I think there's probably like 70% of the portfolios I see online have super small thumbnails. They're like almost impossible to see the UI. The UI is also always like they like people try to make it fancy, but it's like at an angle with like a reflection, and it's like impossible to see, okay, like what is in this UI? I can't understand what this person designed. So just simple, beautiful, face on, like bold, big, and so that I can see like the details of the product that you designed. Even better if you can include some micro interactions, some motion. I'd love to see your motion design chops. Um, a short little 10-second prototype is worth like 1,000 words more, 1,000 times better than a static mock usually. So we talked about visuals, but now process, right? So in your process, I want to hear, how did you navigate challenges? How did you adapt to specific situations? I don't necessarily want to hear, first I did this, then I did this, then I did this. I don't need like an ordered list of all the steps you took. I need the most relevant challenge within each step. So for instance, you might want to talk about, we ran into a constraint with blah, blah, blah. This is how I overcame it, right? And there's different constraints you can talk about. And so you really, really, really want to focus on the challenges, and then fit that into a story. Okay, that brings me to my next point, which is like talk mostly about struggles. Cover at least 3 types of struggles in every case study: organizational struggles, technical, and strategic. I want to kind of see a breadth of all 3. I don't want to hear just happy stories. I really, really want to hear about things that you overcame or things that you didn't overcome, and things that you would have wished you did, or learnings, right? Maybe there's something there that you would have done differently next time. I want to hear about that, because that shows me who you really, really are as a designer, and as somebody who might work at a company in the future. So talk about some of the lessons learned. Um, One other kind of pet peeve there is, for a lot of case studies, I see lessons learned like all the way at the bottom in like a small section. I don't find they're like always super insightful or super helpful. It's often better to weave those like insights and lessons into the case study, so that as I read it, I understand roadblock, how you overcame it, lesson, and then move forward on that. So think more about your storytelling technique as well there. Um, there's some really great books out there on storytelling, but a very, very basic storytelling technique is like, set the context, right? Introduce a character in an environment, talk about a conflict, and then a resolution. That's pretty much it. Think of it as like a Hollywood movie. That's like basically the story arc, right? It's like environment, context, character, conflict resolution. So try to organize some of your case study in that style. There's also other ways to tell stories. Sometimes you can tell the story like backwards, which sometimes is really interesting, starting with the solution and working backwards from there. Sometimes you can just start in the middle. So play it up. All your case studies don't have to be the same. You can have different formats, different structures to each case study. All right, so that's like struggles. And finally, like, I keep saying this, but like, obsess over the reading experience. Use scannable headlines so that people don't have to read. Use annotations. So on every single artifact that you show, you should have annotations pointing out 2 or 3 big ideas of what you want the reader to take away, right? And this is, again, just like good communication design. Use very short paragraphs, very short sentences. Um, Typically, I recommend to my mentees, like when they write their case study, they write it out the first time. I'm like, okay, you wrote it out the first draft. How do we make this 50% shorter? Or maybe start with 20% shorter. And then again, how do you make this another 20% shorter? Keep making it shorter until you get to the bare essence of the story, until you can cut it basically in half. So think about that. Think about making it scannable. Um, Also, I think a lot of people don't do this very great, is writing the story to someone who never heard about your project or company for the first time. I can't tell you how many times I stumble on a case study, and it's really hard for me to understand, is this like, were they hired to do this? Is this like a contract, or is this like a a student project for a professor, or just that overall context tends to always be missing. And so I'll have to maybe like go back to the resume and like see, okay, like this project was for like this course. Okay, it's for like a school project, right? But by that point, you've already lost me, right? So make sure the context is really, really clear. I'm hearing it for the first time. Um, you as a designer might have been immersed in a particular vertical or business, and you might be using acronyms that I don't understand. So just like dumb it down so that your average reader can understand it. And so that's really, really, really important. My bonus tips here are how to make it basically personal. And personal means like also having personality. You want to stand out. You want the article and the case study to be written in a way where it feels like it's an article, right? Where I'm going into it and I'm learning something as a hiring manager from it, where I benefit from it. And so I'm not just going in there to like evaluate, okay, should we interview this candidate or not? I'm going in there because like I want to learn. I maybe even can be entertained a little, right? So keep it professional, but also I think you could approach it from a point of view of turning this almost into like an article somebody might want to read. And so there's kind of like maybe 6-ish ways to do that. You can use life analogies, right? Relate it to different experiences, right? Metaphors, right? So when I first started working on this project and working on this UI, it reminded me of navigating like this foreign city, right? That's like a really easy to understand analogy that you can explain. You could also uh, blend it with a hobby, right? We call it hobby fusion, right? Baking and UX, like a recipe for disaster. You can also use a lot of humor. I've seen uh, kind of really fun, interesting comic strips that describe the problem really well, and just kind of entertain me a little. I also I've seen folks doing small little video intros right at the top of their case study, which has been awesome, right? Because I can watch maybe a 20-second video, hear their unique pitch, hear their voice, and like get a gist of what they're trying to kind of portray in that case study, and then I can just scan through it. So think about using video a bit more. Definitely not longer than 30 seconds, but if you can do like a 15 to 20-second short intro, that that does really well with recruiters. Okay, so those were my 5/6 tips. Just to recap, um, there's like a whole slew of evaluation criteria I've used throughout my career, but I've tried to boil it down to some of these basics. And so I'll approach it from 2 perspectives, again, always from the recruiter, HR perspective, and then from the hiring manager perspective. So from the recruiter perspective, I look for basics, right? Like how much experience does this person have? Does their portfolio match what they have in their resume? So for instance, in the resume, they said they had 3 years of experience, and I go onto their portfolio and they have 1 case study. I might think there is a mismatch, right? And move on, right? So how much experience do they have? Does the portfolio and resume match? Aesthetics, aesthetics, aesthetics. Does this person have beautiful UI, really good visual sense, enough that it looks so professional that I want to pass this on to a hiring manager? The third kind of thing they might look at is like, is this work relevant to what the position is looking for? So maybe the position is to work on an analytical tool, and this case study is all about data viz and analytics. Perfect, right? You've really, really done like a good fit between what the company wants and what experience you have. So you want to try and have that more and more of a fit. For some people, this is kind of another trick. They have a lot of different versions of their portfolio homepage. So let's say they're targeting 2 or 3 different sectors. Um, they'll have their healthcare UX homepage, and that will have the healthcare case study at the top. They might have their fintech like homepage, and so the fintech case study might be at the top. And that way, like the recruiter sees the relevance like immediately. So that's like kind of a good tip, is to like reorder your case studies depending on which one you want to show off for the job you're applying to. Some other things a recruiter looks at in general is like, can they work independently? Did they work with other people? And can they, is there evidence that they on their own pushed for a solution and like led part of the solutioning? Um, Often they look for, have they seen projects to launch, right? Or is this just something conceptual? Launch projects tend to do a little better with recruiters. And then also, is this recent work? Like sometimes I get portfolios and it's like, this is a case study from 2020. Like this cannot be their most recent best work. Like what's going on here, right? And so you always want to show recent work, ideally from the last year or less. Now, from the hiring manager perspective, they go a little deeper. So the recruiter, again, shortlists a bunch of candidates. And then as a hiring manager, I might go in and look at, okay, like how complex was this problem that they were trying to address? Was it a problem that needed to be reframed? Maybe they were given the wrong problem to solve and the designer figured out a more valuable problem to solve, right? That's really cool. So how complex were the problems that they were addressing, and how deep did they go into the problem definition and the reframing of the problem? Collaboration, specifically for larger companies, they look especially for like people who've worked in teams, right? So did they work in a team? Is there evidence of like collaboration within a team? What conflicts did they encounter? Could they resolve them? How it was resolved? Did they learn something? So collaboration is like a really big part of that. Strengths and expertise. So sometimes it's not super clear what somebody's strength is when I look at a portfolio. And so maybe you should start thinking about, okay, like what is my strength? Is my strength visual design? So I'm going to have like really awesome UI. Is my strength design system? So I'm going to make sure to like cover that really well. Is my strength research, and specifically like qualitative research? So think about like, there's, 12 to 14 skills that make up like a UX designer. So think about like one or two that really you want to stand out for each case study, and then try to vary it. So, one case study might really highlight your research skills, another might highlight your UX, another more your design system, so that you have more to play around with when you apply. And then the hiring manager can see, oh, like this person clearly has like a variety of skills that they're trying to show. Um, so another thing that we look at is craft and output. Again, I look for like examples of product design that are really compelling, that are interesting, that are innovative and creative, things I haven't seen before. That's really, really important. I also look at, obviously the quality of their thinking, the quality of their product design, and the quality of their approach as well. And then also the outcome, like what happened, what did customers say, what was the impact on the eng team, did any metrics shift, right? What in the business was improved as a result of this project? So that's like roughly what a hiring manager would look at. Um, so everything we just talked about was mostly about website portfolio design, right? The other side of the coin, right, is what I mentioned earlier, which is portfolio presentations. And so that's a little later in the interview stage, right? And that's when you're essentially, you got your foot in the door, you had a really great meeting with HR, and now maybe your next interview after your screening interview is presenting your portfolio. And so what you want to do for that interview is, you don't want to just scroll through your website. That's really, really hard as a presenter, right? Because there's not as much focus. The audience kind of loses focus, right? Because there's a lot to see on the page. There's a lot of scrolling. And so what you want to do is translate some of that work into a presentation. Um, so think about that. Think about how you want to tell your story. Do you want to tell the story like in the same way as the website? Do you want to tell it in a different way? Slide decks are a little different because they're a little more like linear in nature, right? And so think about like how you would want to tell your story. One thing there I wanted to mention with specifically portfolio slides is they tend to look all the same. They tend to always have like the same structure. And so what I would suggest is really, again, try to vary the story. You don't need to go in the order that the project went in, right? So if the project started with project brief and then like research and then persona and you don't need to go in that order at all. You can start in the middle, you can start at the end, you can cut out different parts. So be a little creative on how you tell that story, and don't be afraid to also cut out artifacts that don't advance your story. Like maybe you created a journey map, but you don't really need to show that if that doesn't advance the story. Totally fine. So think about creative ways to advance the story. And then finally, tell a story, balance breadth with depth. Make sure when you're presenting with slides that you're narrowing your focus onto one or two features and going really, really deep within those. I don't want to hear about every single feature you designed, just don't have time for that. The interview is like 30 minutes usually to an hour. So in that time, I would rather go in, like kind of dive into a prototype, hear about the prototype, hear about the design, and hear about how it evolved. So really, especially for your presentation, focus most of it on prototypes, like walkthroughs, and then the evolution of that prototype over time. I want to see like how it evolved. Um, all right. My last final bonus tip before we take questions is like, please get a UX mentor. And I'm not just saying it because I'm a UX mentor. They're incredibly valuable. They help you. Basically, you can think of them as like a shortcut. They help you avoid making all these mistakes that are not written in any books or in any Medium articles. They're just not there or any podcasts. So try to get a mentor that will really help you with your website case study and with your portfolio, especially. And if you're lucky, you'll get a mentor that also is an accountability partner that helps you source real projects, and will help you, craft a better portfolio. And on that note, before we take questions, I'm going to leave you with my website, uxmentor.net. And I will also give you a coupon code if you're interested in my services, which is $200 off your first month of mentoring. And you just have to put in the code BeginX 2025. So with that, Michael, let's go into questions. I see like streams of questions. I see like 16 here and then a bunch in the webinar chat.
Yeah, I was surprised as well. They were like, we haven't even mentioned it yet, and I already see like 2,500 questions, which is amazing. I love it. So keep those coming. And as always, please read others' questions as well. This way, you have a feature to upvote them as well. So this will help prioritize everything and ensure that we take the ones that you guys are most interested in. And Earl, by the way, I want to say huge thanks. That was amazing. Lots of great insights and tips, as
Right.
usual. Like very, very insightful, honestly. Um, so again, reminder, please use the Q&A tab, right? And that's where you can upload those questions. Again, please review others, upvote, and we'll try to basically go in that order. I do have quite a few questions prepared for you as well, Earl, for our interview. So, but I'll prioritize. I'll try to make sure we take as many questions from our wonderful audience because, and we'll try just make sure that your questions are on point and are specifically about portfolios, case studies, and getting hired in 2025 as it relates to portfolios and case studies. So that we ensure everyone's time is used effectively here, right? So we don't talk about something completely different. Also, don't worry, I see some people raising their hands. Don't worry about raising your hands. If you have a question, just use the Q&A tab. So go to the Q&A tab and just put it there, review others. Same for the third time, upload others' questions as well. All right. All right. And just
These
a
are
reminder,
great. I'm
well,
just reading the questions. They're so great. I can't wait to help answer all of these.
amazing, amazing. And I know you're really good at like because sometimes people give like they talk too long. Sometimes they are too high level. But you usually what you do is you are on point, but your answers are not overly long, right? So it's like that's kind of the golden middle. And we're able to get through a lot of questions quickly, but still give lots of insights. And just a reminder, so we'll make a special announcement about the program that we're running closer to the end of the event, and we'll also share the career transition roadmap summary handout. So stick around if you'd like to get that. All right. So Earl, if you had three more top portfolio tips, I know you provided already a ton, but if you don't have any more, that's sort of fine. Anything else you want to add in terms of maybe three more tips or anything you want to share?
Yeah. Um, one tip maybe that I haven't shared is basically to be really selective about the projects. You only really need like 3 to 4 projects on your website portfolio. A lot of people I see have like 20 projects and they try to show like quantity. So I would suggest don't show tons of projects. Assume the recruiter is only going to go into the first one. So just make sure that first one is like really your best and really that you've spent like so much time on it. You feel really proud of it. So first project is like the key. It's like the money shot, right? That it's the money shot that is going to hopefully result in a call. Spend a lot of time on that first top case study. Really important. Um, Second is don't forget like the to put the basics on your website portfolio, right? Like your location, a little about you, like where can I find your resume? Think like of an HR recruiter person again, they have like hundreds of applicants per position to get through. Like they might have not even remembered or can't find the tab of like what they clicked to get into your portfolio. So they're like, oh, where's this person's resume? Where's their email? Like I want to contact them, right? And so think about like a busy recruiter, like how would you design for them? So repeat some of the information in your resume, put a link to it, put your location, put your preferred pronouns, like anything you want that represents you, put that on there. But don't forget the basics. That's like maybe my second biggest point because people forget the basics all the time. And third, in terms of the actual design of the portfolio, which we didn't talk about, like keep it simple. Unless you're applying for a visual design role or a motion design, like design your portfolio so that the focus and the emphasis is on the products that you designed, not on the design of the website itself. Too often I see so many folks trying to have like really fancy illustrations, animations, and it actually just really distracts and takes away from the product story that you're trying to tell. So keep the focus on the product stories.
Awesome. Thank you, Earl. In terms of mistakes, anything else you want to add in terms of maybe like top one, two, three mistakes that people make with regards to kind of their overall portfolio?
Yeah, really great question. So definitely the number one mistake is formatting their case study in terms of a formulaic process. And I think it's kind of maybe we just do this because there's like an echo chamber of all designers kind of do this where they always start with like problem, research, persona, customer journey, right? So blow up that format. Do not use that format. Just use a format that works for the story you're trying to tell. And so the tip there is like really think about like what is the storyline here? Most designers are not the best at telling stories. It's always like a skill that we try to work on. So think about like if you were to explain this to your mom or your dad or a cousin who's not in tech or is not in product design, like how would you explain the story in a way that they understand what you shipped? So really, really dumb it down, try to go to like the bare essence of the story and don't use a formulaic design process to explain it. The other tip there is the order in which you did the project is not the order in which you need to lay it out in your case study. So if in your project, if you started off with research first, that doesn't need to be the first section. That could be the end, the middle. It could be anywhere. You could start off just with the insights, right? So just again, kind of blowing up some of those myths, like think about good storytelling and like what, think about good movies you've seen, good TV shows, think about what makes the stories really good and try to like apply that to your projects.
All right. Awesome. So let's take a quick question from Deep T here. It already has 6 upvotes, so great job, Deep T. You're the winner as of now. We'll have winners named every few minutes or so. So Deep T is asking, how do you start documenting your process in a constructive way as you're working through a project? Asking as someone who's not super structured in their thinking. And part 2 is, what is the best approach to creating business goals, business metrics?
Great question. The first one is my favorite because no one documents their projects until it's too late, where you can't remember any of the details, and then you can't remember the details in your case study or for your interviews. It's kind of a disaster. So what I recommend is blocking off 30 minutes in your calendar every week to journal, right? And you want to just journal at a very high level. What did you do this week? Your top 3 to 5 bullets, what I did this week, what what was the top single challenge, and then how I solved it, right? And that's all you really need. If you do that over a period of a year, 6 months, you'll have a really long list of different examples and different tidbits to pull from. You could even take that, put it into Chat GPT or Gemini, right? And have it summarize for you what were the top challenges of the year, right? But I do highly, highly recommend journaling every week. The second benefit of that is it forces you to reflect on the work. And if you reflect on it, you end up actually having more like deeper reflections and like a deeper product story. And it actually really helps move your current work further along. So reflection is like a really important part of being a designer. Um, for some people, that's reflection when they do physical exercise. For others, it's when they go and journal in a doc. But ultimately, reflect on the work of the week and really set time to do that every week. Did that answer part 1? Michael, did you have anything to add there?
I think that was great. That was perfect.
Great.
I think that those are great tips.
Great. And let me answer then part 2, which is like, what is the best approach to creating business goals, business metrics? So, um, as a designer, our jobs, right, is to basically move the business in the right direction, but also move users in the right direction. And so we're always like balancing business metrics and user metrics. And so at the start of every project, right, before the project even begins, it's really, really important to write out with your product owner, your product manager, and your engineer, what is the business metrics that we're trying to move? What are the user metrics that we're trying to move? You don't have to have like the exact numbers you're trying to move, just like an overall sense of what you're moving. And then by the end of the project, you can like hopefully develop a clearer and clearer sense of what exactly the exact numbers are. Best approach though is start at the beginning of the project, write those all out, and then evolve those as the project goes.
Awesome. Thank you, Earl.
Yeah.
All right. And I know you also talked about this a bit, but anything else you want to share in terms of who you should be designing your portfolio for?
Yeah, great question. So as I mentioned, there's kind of like 2 big audiences. I didn't mention some of the other audiences, so let me touch on that. So the 2 largest audiences are recruiters, or at smaller companies, they're HR. And then the second audience is hiring managers. And so very different needs. Each of them have like a very look for very different things. But generally speaking, recruiters and HR people they don't only recruit for UX, they recruit for a lot of different roles. And so they tend to have like a superficial understanding of UX, which generally means like to them UI design, unfortunately. So they tend to equate really great UI. If you have like great UI, you must be a great UX designer. And so you can kind of trick them and have great UI to get your foot in the door a little. And so think about again, like UI for recruiters. And then for hiring managers, it's more about that deeper problem solving, critical thinking, independence, soft skills, collaboration, etc. The other audience members that like the readers that I didn't mention are all the other people on the hiring committee or on the team who will give input into the hiring decision. And that tends to be other designers, researchers, product managers, engineers, even. And so for those audiences, you might want to tailor your portfolio for them depending on, if you get one-on-one time with them. And often you do. So like you might want to present your portfolio differently to an engineer than to like a researcher or to a product manager, right? Have a different angle, an angle that they would be more interested in, right? Because like a product manager would be way more interested in like how you move the needle on the business, whereas like an engineer might be more interested in like all the technical skills required behind that design. So yeah, think about your audience. And if you don't think about your audience, it's a much harder sell because like as a UX designer, that's like your number one job is to like think about your audience. So when you're interviewing and designing your resume and portfolio, really, really, really think about who you're designing for.
All right, awesome. Um, what else did he? So, Jason put a question that got quite a few upvotes, but it doesn't have a question mark at the end. So we'll try to figure out what the exact question is, Jason. So, but it sounds great. So for someone who's had a nonlinear path to UX like yourself, you said all of the other positions you've had helped round you out and be a better UX person. I've also had various types of design roles, so I find it conflicting to have a portfolio that is quote unquote focused on only one aspect, UX, of all the skills I've amassed, like animation, video, experiential. So I know there is no question mark, so it's more like a comment, but any thoughts on this, Earl?
Yeah, it almost seemingly conflicts, right? I think the idea here is, you know, all of those skills make you your like your own unique designer, right? Which is awesome. But what I would try to avoid is cramming all of those skills into like a single case study, right? Because it's probably way too much. You can't go that deep. So for instance, the skills that Jason amassed in like animation, right? That he should pick like one case study to really show that, right? And then maybe another case study is where he would really, really pick on like more of the experimentation skills, right? And so what I would encourage Jason to do is like think about, okay, like what are all my skills and can I like equally divide those up between my 3 to 4 case studies so that I'm showing like the breadth of my skills. Again, if you try to jam it all into one case study, it's a little harder. For me, I like was a sound designer, and so I had one case study where I had the opportunity to show all the sounds I added to a product, right? And so think about like what skills you have, what you can pull, and like how you can distribute them across your case studies.
Yeah, I think another just quick thought I have on that is
Yeah.
just maybe just think like, what is your goal? Like, where are you trying to get, right? And that will hugely influence like what you actually put in there, right? In that portfolio and what you highlight, right? Because if let's say you want to move in one direction, of course you want to highlight one type of projects. As I think we had an event with Jared Spool, and he was saying basically that your marketing, you're describing your experience in a sense is like what you want to get in the future, like what your goals are, right? So not just what you have done, but how does it map to what you want to do, right? So basically just kept having that goal in mind, right, would be very helpful. It's not just like a bucket of everything, right? And unless you want everyone to be reaching out to you, hopefully, about everything, which usually doesn't happen, right? Um, but yeah, basically just focusing about like the goals and the future. Um, all
It's
right.
a great question because it's like the other thing is it's so hard. Like you have 30 seconds to impress this recruiter, right? You have to be pretty selective about how you represent yourself in 30 seconds. Very hard goal.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. All right, so question from Vidi. And by the way, if I mispronounce anyone's names, obviously that's not intentional, right? So please forgive me for that. I'll try my best. How can you showcase impact in your resume or portfolio when you've worked on 0 to 1 products for startups but didn't get to measure the results?
Really, I get that question all the time. Um, and I think, ideally, you would have measured the results, but in this non-ideal world, which is, what 99% of us live in, um, you would still want to show that you thought about the results you intended to create, right? And so, it's probably enough just to showcase, okay, like at the beginning of the project, this is what we really wanted to achieve, right? We wanted to have, I don't know, an X% increase in growth for this area, right? And for the user metric, we wanted to move like from this to this, right? So you can think about like what did you want to move, and talk about it and explain why. And that's like enough for me to get a sense of like, oh, well, like if they measured it, then they would have had a clear idea of did they achieve it or not. So I think, the best thing there is really to like talk about like anticipated results and also like what you wish you would have measured. Um, and your like thought process there. Yeah, that's kind of like the best answer I think there. Um, the other thing I would say is, um, for that case study, I think would be also really interesting to explain like why you didn't measure it, and like maybe it's like a learning of like, oh, in the future I wish I would have measured it and this is why. So I'd want to hear a bit more about like, well, how would have they measured it, and like why didn't they measure it, and what would they have done in the future to measure it.
All right. By the way, Jason was saying thank you for that answer. That was the earlier answer, so you're welcome.
You're very welcome.
All right. So Vidi was also asking, and I think we had that question before as well in terms of examples of portfolios that are ideal to take inspirations from. I know you probably don't have something like handy right this moment, unless you do, Earl. That can put.
I,
So,
I don't have any that on the spot to send out, but there are plenty of sites that have great portfolios. I think there's also plenty of maybe not so great ones to learn from, and those are equally as valid, right? Like I think it's good to kind of look at both. But the sites that I am going to call out are curation websites, which are pretty decent. They're Wall of Portfolios.in, Cofolios, Best Folios, and Case Studies Club. Those are the four that I'm aware of. And
all
I
right.
can I can paste them in later.
Yeah, yeah, if you could. I was gonna ask you to repeat it, or and then maybe Mika can type it. But yeah, if you
Here
could
we
just
go. I
paste it
just
later.
pasted it in.
All right, you're fast. All right, awesome. Okay. All right. In terms of case studies specifically, Earl, in your opinion, what are like the top 3 biggest mistakes specifically related to case studies?
Yeah, so often, I mean, we talked about some of them being formulaic, but the other kind of big issue I see is that either the case study is like a report, like way too long, and I can't understand, like it's just so long that I only have 30 seconds, like I can't read it. So I see that, and then I see the other side of it, which is there's nothing there. It's just the end result. It's what we call like a work sample. And so what you want is some to be like somewhere in between, right? Like you don't want to be a work sample where it's just the end result. You don't want to be at the other end where it's like a full report that's 20 pages long. Somewhere in the middle, on average, like a good length for a case study is about 15 short sections, like you maybe like 6 to 7 page scrolls. That's like the rough length I usually target with my mentees. Um, I think the other again mistake with a case study that I see is not doing any good communication design. So meaning they're kind of writing it like it's a paper or a long article, right? But instead, what we want is to communicate something for each section, and we want to communicate a big idea for each section. So often I'll see like sections that I read this section and there's like a lot of different information, but I can't take away like one idea. So think about like if you're going to have 15 sections in your case study, each section is like one big idea that advances the story. Like how would you structure it? So essentially your case study is like 15 story points. Um, yeah, think about it again as a story. Think about it as like a short story, a scannable story, not too long, not too short. Um, I think the other mistake I often see is a lot of context, like way too much context, where the designer might go through like the entire company context, like all the research they did, all the insights, and especially for like a UX design role, I kind of just want to hear like very roughly what the context is, like roughly what the insights are, and then like how they applied it to the solution, where the focus is more on like the solution and how it evolved. So don't spend so much time like on context and like overkilling it with context. That's probably like another big mistake I see.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Um, so I know we talked about metrics and success of the project. So Jeff asked a related question to that. Let's just see, maybe you want to add anything else besides what we already discussed, Earl. So Jeff was asking, for case studies, if you don't have access to metrics that demonstrate success of the projects, or the metrics aren't actually positive slash favorable, but you don't have other real world projects to include, what's your take on using qualitative feedback instead?
Yeah, qualitative feedback is great. I don't think says like it doesn't show like the full picture. Because like, okay, taking a step back, like what is the point of putting metrics in your case study? Like let's think about what that is. The main point of putting in metrics is to show that you and your team had a really clear idea of like what you wanted to achieve, right? And if they were favorable, unfavorable, I think hiring managers doesn't like care as much about like how favorable or unfavorable the result is. They really just care about like, did they really think about like the user metrics they wanted to move, the business metrics, and did they like try to move them, right? That's kind of the goal. Um, Especially with that, like you want to, yeah, you want to show like that business thinking and user thinking is there. Qualitative feedback is great, but it usually doesn't show like the full picture, and it's usually just kind of like a small signal of like if you're going in the right direction or not. And so you can include that, but I would also definitely want to see like, well, what were they trying to move with this project, and like were they thinking about it? The one other point I wanted to mention is if the results were unfavorable, that is equally interesting and important to put in the case study. I too often see case studies that are just like a very happy story of like we started at point A, everything was great, we shipped it, the metrics were amazing, I tripled, blah, blah, blah. That's not a really interesting story, honestly. It's actually more interesting to hear like that it was like a massive failure and why and what you learned from it. And so definitely think about like putting in like things that were unfavorable as well, and especially putting those in your different iterations. Because I want to hear more about like again like the challenges and like the failures more than the wins.
Awesome. Thank you, Earl. That's great. So I want to take another quick question from Milena. How do you view portfolios that include work from past careers, like art direction, for example? Can those projects add value, or do they risk distracting from UX-focused work?
Really good question. It really, really depends on the role. So, and this is the thing in general, like when you're applying to a job, you have to do your homework before you apply to that job, right? So like reading the job description, sure, that's one thing, but often the job description is like pretty generic. Do a little digging. See if you can see who posted that position, what team is it for, right? And then you can think about, okay, like would art direction like help me with this job or would it just be a distraction? So for instance, if you're applying to uh, a design system team's role, right? Maybe the title of the position is like UX designer, but as you start reading it and like looking at who posted it, you're like, oh, it's like a UX designer in a design system team. And specifically, this role is like doing a lot of illustrations, then for sure it would help. Um, Make sure to send a portfolio with that type of work in it, right? But if it's like strictly more like a UX role, right, then probably leave it out, right? Not as important. You can leave it in your resume, but probably not a case study on your website. And that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier. Like sometimes it's helpful to have different versions of your portfolio homepage to really cater to the different types of roles that you apply to, where you reorder your projects, pick your top four that most apply to that role.
All right, thank you, Earl. I want to take Laura's question quickly and then ask you something kind of more, a little bit more higher level in general. So Laura was asking, can you highlight the differences between a portfolio that you would attach with your application versus a case study you present on an interview?
Great question. They are they are different but interrelated. So the analogy I like to use is your website portfolio that you attach with your application, um, that's kind of like a trailer to a movie, right? The movie is like your portfolio walkthrough presentation that's like 30 minutes to an hour going kind of more into detail. But your website portfolio, um, that you attach with an application, that tends to be a lot higher level. It's just like the tiny tidbits. It's like sound bites, media clips of just like roughly what you did, a story, right? But like a high level story. And then your portfolio presentation, that's like the full story. With your portfolio presentation, it tends to focus on usually 1 to 2 case studies that you would present. So you're going really deep. And it also tends to focus more on the actual like product design work, the prototype work, and how that prototype evolved. Um, so yeah, think there are like pretty big differences. Again, think of like your website portfolio as like a trailer to a movie, and then like the portfolio presentation is like the movie. Hopefully that analogy makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. And sometimes, Earl, right? So I would say some website portfolios, they can still be quite a movie, right? So it's like,
Yeah, they could. So you don't need the full movie. Save it for the like let like kind of the hiring manager like want to ask you questions about it, right? Like you don't need to give out everything at once. It's like when you go on a first date, like you don't just like do a brain dump of everything about yourself within the first 2 hours, right? Like you start kind of slow. So don't give it all up at once is what I'm trying to say.
all right, awesome. So I know we covered this briefly also before, Earl, but anything else you want to add in terms of what makes a great case study that stands out and makes it appealing to employers, right? I know you talked quite a bit about this,
Yeah.
but anything else
Yeah, I
specifically
think
about
there's
case
maybe
study?
like one more thing. It's such a good question, but it's like also about like the project itself. Like, was this like a really interesting project that I've like never seen before? I haven't experienced an app like this. Like maybe it's like a new way dentists like interact with patients. I saw that the other day. Or maybe it's like a brand new way um, that a credit card company can issue credit cards, which is like super interesting. So, think about like the type of project you're showing. And if you find like, oh, this is actually like a really boring project, like how do you spice it up? How do you make it more interesting? How do you make the storyline more compelling? And often one way to do that is to insert your own vision for that whole area, for that space on top of like the feature work you've done. So um TLDR there is like, don't only show like just the work that you've done, show what your like design intent was for that project, for that space, because that really tells me who you are as a designer, regardless of whether that ended up getting built or not, right? So vision work, that sort of thing, but couple that with like the features that shipped.
Awesome, awesome. All right, so I love how we're like flying through these questions. Amazing, but still
Great,
giving good insights.
great.
So another question. So I want to take a question from Luisa here. So who is asking, what happened if you have a lot of experience but haven't worked on any good or big project?
You can make an older project better by going back to it, redesigning it, reframing it even, and making 60, 70% of the case study what you would have done. And then kind of you can show the end result towards the end as well. So highly encourage you to go back, think about what you would have done differently, what a better, more impactful project would have been, and kind of redesign it.
Yeah, exactly. Or you can
Yeah.
follow similar strategies that folks do when they're transitioning into the field, right? You could
Yeah.
potentially maybe do passion projects if you want, even though they're less effective. Ideally, my biggest favorite part is, of course, just doing like some type of volunteer and a pro bono or basically something real, right? And you can obviously approach a startup, ideally get a team, ideally get a mentor, kind of the going through the tips that I gave earlier and that Earl was talking about as well. And basically just get a bit better, bigger case study projects, right? You could also apply it to beginners as well. This way we do all of that for you.
And
And
then
you
you don't have
just
to worry about sourcing a project on your own, which can be a nightmare. It's not easy.
and help you master the career prep so you can actually nail what happens after that.
Yeah.
All right. And by the way, so everyone is saying thank you, Laura and Milena and Marco, you're welcome. Yeah, thank you for great questions. All right. Here's what I also wanted to ask you, Earl. Let's do a quick recap. Why do you think it's important to have these real client case studies in your portfolio, not just hypothetical student projects? And what's the difference?
Yeah, really great question. So the thing with theoretical case studies is they tend to not solve real problems, right? They tend to be these kind of like fake design prompts, where you're just kind of showing like how you might solve like a potential problem, not a real problem. And so what happens is like your case study ends up being very like uninteresting usually, and tends to be like very theoretical. On top of that, you're not able to show like the basic skills of being a designer, which are like soft skills, like all the soft skills that it takes to be a designer: collaboration, empathy, trust, working in a team, like all of those skills, really hard to show through a case study that's theoretical. Um, and then you end up not having great interview answers too, because you don't have like great examples to pull from of like struggles, right? With a theoretical project, you tend not to go through many struggles or challenges, right? Because it is theory. But with a real project, oh boy, you're going to go through struggles every day. And right. So those are the things that like really tell me who you are as a designer. Right. And so I want to hear about those. I want you to experience those, and I want to hear about those more.
It's awesome. Yeah, thank you, Earl. Um, all right, so June was asking, June Kwan, what is the short list that hiring manager have before they hand out candidates to hiring managers?
Great question. Maybe I could take you through like a theoretical example. So imagine there's 500 people that will apply to, let's just say, like a healthcare UX role. Out of those 500 people, 200 of them don't have a portfolio URL. They're eliminated right off the bat. So you're down to 300. Out of those 300, we look for people that have relevant experience in that industry. So in those 300, oh, 20 of them have already worked in healthcare. Great. Let's shortlist those 20. Out of those 20, 20 links go through each portfolio. 10 of those portfolios are really good. I'm going to pass those 10 portfolios on to the hiring manager. That's roughly what like a 500 application pipeline looks like, right? You go from 500 to 300 pretty quickly, and then down to people with industry experience in that area. And then out of those, 50% have probably really great portfolios. The other 50% probably not as much.
Awesome. Yeah, it's fast and quick and nice.
Yeah, that's the pipeline.
All right. So Rob is asking about, so we have to answer this question because it comes up every single time, and lots of people face this issue. And Rob put it in both Q&A and in the chat. So thank you, Rob. How do you showcase work projects that have a strict NDA?
Great question. So you really have to think about the context in which you're showing the work. If you're showing the work at an interview over Zoom, that's a very different context than putting it on a website for everybody to see, right? So different levels of risk, different levels of comfort. If it's in the Zoom presentation, Meet presentation, probably a little more fluid, a little more flexible. You can show more of the work. If it's on a website, there's a couple things you can do. You can anonymize it, right? You can just show high level ideas. You could put it behind a password potentially. I don't want to get into trouble because I'm not a lawyer, but it has been done where people put it behind a password. Um, what I will say though is like you do have to be careful. There are companies that uh, will really, really, actively look to make sure that none of their information leaks. So you have to be careful. But in general, like probably a good approach for like the website is to like make the mocks like high level, anonymize it. But you can still usually tell a story. It just might not be as specific. Michael, you probably deal with this all the time. What do you suggest people do? It's a hard one.
Yeah, same tips pretty much. And I would also, yeah, try to be careful because not just because of the ethical part, which is important, right? But because if you do something that shows you're doing something unethical, that tells like something to your potential future employer and what may happen in their case, right? So I would just still be ethical, maybe sanitizing. Sometimes what you could do is just remove all the mentions of the actual company, but still keep the content. In that case, they can't recognize who that is. Of course, that has to be kind of vetted with the actual organization as well, right? So you would have to ensure. But it's, yeah, it's a tough problem. So sometimes, so it's, and what I would recommend if you're, let's say, if you're just building your portfolio, right, I would just look for projects that don't have such restrictions, or maybe even if they have an NDA, but an NDA that doesn't prevent you from showing your work, right? And if it's like a nice paying job, etc., right, then it's a different story, of course. If you're in the field already, right, then you just follow the tips that we just discussed. All right, Earl, so what I also wanted to ask you is for building your portfolio and getting those real client case studies, maybe let's talk briefly about internships specifically. How helpful do you think internships are, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of those specifically for getting case studies, and who do they best work for?
Really great question. Um, Internships are a fantastic way to get your foot in the door. They're they're often hard to come by. A lot of companies uh, don't want junior designers to look after. Um, but if you're lucky and you pitch yourself well, you can try and get an internship. I would say what they're looking for there is like very independent designers who don't need to be told what to do. They're also looking for they tend to look for folks, like especially for internships, they tend to look for folks that are enrolled in a university program, but not always. So you can look at other things like apprenticeships. That's like another one. You can look for contract roles, part-time. So there's like kind of like a lot of different flavors for internships, and you can try to get like creative about it. Um, I think the other thing I would say there is, especially with internships, um, you still need to have like a portfolio to get your foot in the door, right? It's still an area where you have some experience. And so, everything you're doing for your normal like job prep you have to do for internships. So it's not that different. Um, But yeah, definitely internships are harder and harder to come by these days. Michael, I don't know what your experience has been, but you tell me.
Yeah, those are great points, Earl. I think
Yeah.
you kind of got, really nailed it. And I feel like, great internships can be amazing, right? The problem is they're very hard to find and they can be as competitive as jobs. And there are lots of not great ones where you will just be doing very low level work, which doing some of it is fine, but if it doesn't get you any case studies or any portfolios, then what's the point, right? I mean, it will get you some experience you put in your resume, but it doesn't really build your portfolio and case studies, right? Which kind of destroys the purpose, right? So I would not do those, right? So I would initially, yeah, basically just look for if there is something that where you will do meaningful work and where you would get great case studies, right? And if it's unpaid, right? And then there is a paid one, but of course you cannot predict all the time, right? What exactly we'll be doing there. But I would always go with if you're building yourself up, if you're learning, if you're transitioning, focusing on that. Then once you're in the field, once you have all those case studies, you're a great candidate there. Once you're in the field, you can focus on making money, right? So initially, basically, first you have to figure out, I remember the saying from somewhere, are you learning or are you earning, right? So it's hard to do both at the same time.
I love that. I
All
love that.
right.
And the one other thing that I would add in there too is um, if it's volunteering and unpaid, there might be more leeway for you to turn the role into something a little more strategic to get like better case study out of it. You have a little more leverage. So it's actually sometimes better to have like an unpaid internship because there's a little more give and take versus paid, where the expectation is kind of a little more like, you'll do what the company asks you to do exactly and not anything more.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great point. That's what I mention all the time as well. Sometimes, let's say you do pro bono work for some organization or startup, right? Like you said, if it's paid, then they tell you what to do, right? If it's not, maybe, right? If you're volunteering, then you have much more say in shaping the project, right? Which is amazing, right? Initially, of course, I'm talking about when you're switching careers, not in general, right? So, um, and in that case, and don't be afraid to suggest more stuff to shape the project. I feel like the mistake a lot of people make, they just get there to this, they volunteer and then they just wait what to do and then for the company to tell them. So you have to take more initiative, you have to show more leadership and basically not be afraid to push back a little bit maybe if maybe what they're asking you to do is not in line with your goals. So you have to balance it out. You have to ensure that it's highly beneficial for them, but you also have to ensure that it's actually highly beneficial for you, right? So, and that's sometimes not easy. And Earl, so since we started talking about volunteering and pro bono projects, right? So anything else you want to add in terms of your thoughts on those, on volunteering, pro bono projects, and for getting portfolio case studies?
Yeah. I think I'm just gonna say be really selective about the type of clients you work with and the types of projects that you take on. Often a lot of those projects can start off to be pretty low quality, right? Like I need to make this app prettier, or you need to redesign my website, right? They're like kind of lower value projects, but you can use that as a starting point to really like turn that in more into like a more valuable project. And that's often like our job anyways as designers, is like to find more value always in the things we're working on. Um, and so what I always recommend is to try and like work with a client who's like open to that, open to you working on strategy and open to different ideas, right? Like they might have like an initial suggestion, like, oh yeah, can you like redesign this website? But you might be like, well, I noticed your like app is like doesn't really work as intended, right? Maybe can I help with that, right? So like a client that's like open is always like the better choice, because you can like mold and shape that, versus a client that maybe is like a little less collaborative or doesn't have as much time to give you.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you, Earl.
Yeah.
So I have so many great questions here, and I have, wow. So but we will have to wrap up. Let's start wrapping up relatively soon because I know it's getting late and we've been at it for quite some time.
It's totally
Um,
fine. I don't
but
need to eat. I'm good. I have my power bar going, my Red Bull. We're good.
all right. So we'll run until the morning. So, all right, so Sandy is asking a related question that we touched on briefly. Can you keep a menu page of your graphic design work if it relates in your UX portfolio? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, good question. I think it's kind of like similar to the answer I gave before. It really depends on the role you're targeting, right? If you're targeting like a visual design role, UX visual design, or a UX design role that has like a strong visual component, that might be like super relevant. And so you might want to include it. Now, when you say separate page, I wouldn't actually recommend it being physically a separate page because no one's going to click to that page. It kind of has to be like right there with the case studies, or recruiters are going to pass over it. Um, so yeah, it depends on the role. Um, what you could do, and I've seen done really well, is like if your heart is set on like more of a UX role and product design role, and there's like still like a VisD component, you could just have like one case study that just shows like visuals, and that like would be enough. You don't need to have like all your work samples to click on for graphic design. So yeah, just think about like how much do you want to emphasize the graphic design? Is it like a lot or just a little? And if it's just like a little, maybe just like one tile on your website would be like enough on the homepage.
All right, awesome, awesome. Earl, why get a mentor? Let's talk briefly a little bit more about that, and specifically when working on your case studies or your portfolio, like what's the benefit of a mentor?
It's such a good question. Why not a mentor? Um, um, a mentor, a mentor is really like a shortcut, right? Like think about it this way. Like I've worked with so many people who have spent 9 months, a year, even 2 years just trying to get that UX job, trying to get that next UX job, right? And they're going in all sorts of direction. But when you work with somebody who's further ahead in their career than you by at least 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years even, they've experienced probably all of that and more. And they can tell you, oh no, like don't do that, right? Which would have maybe taken you 3 months to figure out on your own, right? And I think the thing there, especially about paid mentorship and not just unpaid mentorship, is paid mentorship, there's like a dual sense of responsibility, right? There's a dual commitment. Uh, with unpaid mentorship, you tend to like meet the mentor like once and then you like might not hear from them because they're not like benefiting that much. And then you might like see them again a year later. Like it's a very unsteady relationship unless you're like directly working together in like a paid job in a company. So I really do think paid mentorship is like the future. It's the way to go. It's a kind of like a fairly new thing. Not a lot of people have heard of it. Not a lot of people have experienced it yet. Um, but what I can tell is for all my mentees, it really has shortcut their process, and gotten them the results they wanted in much shorter time. So they end up saving lots of money, lots of headache, lots of frustration, and they end up getting into jobs much earlier, than they would have otherwise, maybe 2 years early, 3 years early. And so that 2 or 3 years of all that extra money going into mentorship is really, really worth it for them.
Yeah, those are great points. And yeah, and I absolutely agree. Like, and because if you think about it, right? I mean, a mentor, unless you just, like you said, you just meet with them once, right? Of course, they need to be compensated, right? In some way, right? It's, of course, some people can potentially, spend lots of time with someone, but most people don't have lots of time. And also, time is one of our most valuable resources, right? So, I definitely think that if you want to constantly, regularly work with someone, right? Of course, I mean, it's like, you know, maybe when you're building yourself up, you do some pro bono work. But once you're a professional, right, so you don't work for free, right? You get paid. So same for mentorship, right? Unless it's like very quick and just maybe once a year or something like that, right? So
Yep.
then it's a different story,
Yep.
right? And what I also wanted to add is that it's definitely, like you said, like a shortcut is a great way to describe it. And if you think about it, it's not just in UX, like in any area, right? So if you work with a person who have done this, has lots of experience, has seen it all, it just can save you a ton of time, right? And sometimes you may think that was my mistake long years ago as well. I was thinking, oh, I don't have money, so I'll just go this loan route and save money. But then instead, sometimes you should think that, I mean, your time is more valuable often than money, right? And often,
Right.
and even it's actually just makes more sense sometimes, right? Because I say if you get to that goal 6 months faster, you'll get 6 months more of that UX job salary potentially, right? Which will pay handsomely for that mentorship and much more than that, right? So it's just being kind of rational about it too, right? So it's basically just makes it much faster when you have guidance and structure along the way, right? You just accelerate.
It's an investment for yourself and for the future. Um, and it's also UX is just like it's such a practical field that degrees they don't prepare you as well, right? So, a mentor really would, mentor really prepares you much better and somebody in the field who's been doing it for a long time. I think the other benefit there too is, having a mentor really like pushes you to be even more accountable than you would be otherwise too, right? Like some folks um really enjoy like the weekly checking in, right? And saying, okay, like, are we on track? Are we meeting our deadlines, right? And so you end up feeling less stressed because you have like a very clear plan in place with your mentor, a very clear structure, and then the accountability on top of that. And so for a lot of people, it's great because they have the accountability. They have then also like the partnership to work with somebody on something instead of just like in isolation, not knowing, am I doing this right? Am I not? So it gives them more like confidence, motivation, and then, like we said, like basically a big shortcut to get into a job that they might take them 3 years to get into. They can get in 6 months, right, and make all that extra money.
Yeah, exactly. All
Yeah,
right. So I know Luisa asked a question here about specific platform, right? And I think Vasilana also kind of commented on that. And so let's take that quickly, and yeah, we'll take a few more questions quickly, and then we'll start wrapping up. So Luisa asked, "Is Behance okay to showcase my portfolio?"
the short answer is no. Behance is more for like work samples and more like illustration, graphic design samples. It's hard to, you kind of have to break Behance a little to be able to show like a case study. Right? And case study has like, 15 sections with text and a layout. And so the workaround there is to like upload a PDF, but an up PDF is not like a great reading experience. So Behance isn't great for that. Don't recommend it. I recommend a website.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, that's makes sense. All right. So Anamta also asked, I recently joined a UX design program and created an MVP product related to Uber. Will this project be good for a UX case study for a portfolio?
That is a hard one because um it probably doesn't have as much real world context as you like. The folks at Uber, I'm sure, have a lot more context on that problem space, right? So generally I don't recommend like recreating existing apps. They're hard to sell. What might be a better idea is if you're really set on Uber, is to do like an audit on their app and like explain like two or three things that are really not working well, and try to like pitch it to them. And that has worked, but then you're spreading yourself a little narrow. You're going kind of like all in on Uber. So I would only do that or recommend that if you're like really into like, I need to get this job at Uber. And so like, I'm going to put all my effort into it, but otherwise probably not.
Yeah, it's also enough to just to add to that, right? So here's our view, look at this, right? Your first project, right? Your first case study, totally fine, right? To do something hypothetical, to do passion, etc., right? To just start building the skills up, start practicing a little bit. The first case study, if it's hypothetical, it's okay. It's probably even better so you don't annoy clients while you're just starting out and
It's
don't know
true.
much yet, right? So it's probably even better. Maybe one, maybe two max, right? And then after that, there is, personally, I feel like there's no reason not to do real ones, right? So after that, what you could do is just like we discussed before, volunteer, find, do pro bono work for startups, for businesses, for some mission-driven impact companies, maybe if you want to make it more meaningful, like we do in the program, for example, right? So basically, it's just again, make sure it's the challenge with these volunteer roles or pro bono, right, is you have to source them yourself. Ideally, you have to get a team. Ideally, you have to get a mentor. And ideally, you also want to be able to sell that to the actual company, right? Because even if you're working pro bono, it's not always easy to persuade the company because you need to explain not just, oh, I'll do wireframing, I'll do research. You have to explain the actual benefits of like, why should they be doing that, right? Especially if they're not UX folks themselves. Right, so it just takes some legwork, quite a bit of legwork in many cases, but it's just much more valuable than just sitting in your room by yourself and just doing something on your own, which is great too, right? Again, great starting point, great to start with. But then after that, because you want to showcase, as we discussed, those soft skills, collaboration, right, real experience, etc. That just will make it much more effective. So it's just wise to invest your time in those types of projects versus keep doing hypothetical solo projects. So, oh, what I also wanted to remind for anyone who joined us late, right? So please make sure you upload others' questions, right? So we'll take just a few more and then we'll be wrapping up. So if you haven't reviewed others' questions, take a look, be proactive and take initiative here and upload others as well. Um, Okay, Earl. So we have a great question from Jess. So Jess is the winner currently. And I'm not always taking the most upvoted questions just to contradict myself a little bit, because I do want to make sure, let's say someone just joined and they have this question. It sounds like it's a great question, but maybe it hasn't been, reviewed by everyone yet. So I try to take some of those as well. So Jess is asking, you mentioned targeting your case studies and jobs towards specific fields, for example, medical UX. What if you don't know what area you want to go into? How should you target case studies and jobs then?
Such a good question. Do research in your area. Like, I live in San Francisco, so like go on LinkedIn, go on your tool of choice over a 3-month period, see what are like the most popular industries, right? Like right now, is fintech doing well? Not so much, right? Healthcare doing really well. So go in, see what are kind of the most sectors that are more in demand, right? And then tailor that. I think it's good to go demand based. Also to note, the first job you get into, first area you get into, it never ends up being the last. It's just the first. So if you don't like it, great. You tried it out for a year, it didn't work out, but now you can go on to something else because you have that 1 year of experience. So yeah, I would go by supply and demand, if you don't have a strong passion on what you like or don't like at this point. And by the way, it's totally normal not to know like what you like and don't like yet, right? Like if you some people know right off the bat, oh, like I really don't want to work on tools or I only want to work on consumer products. But if you don't know, just go and see what's popular in your area, what's in demand, and just start working on that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, and let me know what you think, Earl. I also think that's what is good about UX field is that it's much it's not as crucial to focus on a specific industry as in many other jobs, right? So in many other jobs, if you don't have like certain number of experience in X type of industry, that's it. Whereas in UX, it's much easier to move around, and your functional
Yep.
skills are typically more important than the actual industry. I mean, any thoughts on that, Earl?
Yeah, I would agree. I think in UX it's much more fluid than a lot of other jobs. Um, Um, I think the other thing, that Jessa can do here is, if you're gonna put together 3, 4 case studies, do one case study in every industry, get a sense for it, right? See which industry you like the best and target that industry too. I do think it's easier right now to go into an industry where you have experience already or you have a case study to show for it, but it's not impossible to go into any other industry.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, let's take one last question and then wrap up. I know we have to let you go, Earl. It's been quite some time. Really appreciate your time here. Um,
Running on fumes. It's great. That Red Bull is really kicking in.
you want to pick the question? I mean,
Um, sure. So I see a message from Sati. I am highly active outside my direct UX role. I've earned multiple awards. Great, that's awesome. I'm also a blogger. Should I include these achievements in my portfolio and presentation, or would it give the impression that I'm too focused on activities outside of work? Would it be better to omit them? Great question. Um, it sometimes it definitely comes across, right? If a resume has too much humor or too much of kind of personality, too much of anything, it could come across as like, oh, this isn't a good culture fit. But in general, awards are great. Blogging is great. The only thing I would say is like try to relate that to the job you're applying to. So in your resume, right, you might talk about blogging, but you might link to an article that's like specifically benefits that company you're applying to, right? Or you might talk about different awards, put the award on the top, like on the top that most relates to what you want the hiring manager to see about your awards. So yeah, awards are great, blogging is great, but try to tailor it again to be relevant to that job so that they take something really awesome away from it.
all right, awesome. Earl, before we wrap up, any final tips or advice you'd like to give to our wonderful audience?
Final tips. Portfolios can be like really stressful. So I just want to acknowledge like the mental health crisis around portfolios. It's it's difficult on the line. There's a lot of do's and don'ts and should I do? And then it's like conflicting. So take a breath. And what I would do is just approach it as a design project, right? An iterative process where you try out your first 2 case studies for 12 weeks, see what happens. If there's no answer, fine, do your second iteration, put it in for another 12 weeks, put it out there. Maybe 1 or 2 people start noticing it. Great. See what that attracts. Maybe they have some feedback for you. Great. Do a third iteration. Portfolio is like a live, breathing thing. Do it in multiple iterations, get feedback early and often. Don't just spend an eternity of like 6 months getting it to be perfect, shipping it, and then realizing it like doesn't resonate at all, right? So treat it as like a very iterative project, just like you would for any other project with continuous product discovery, continuous research, continuous feedback. And then over time, it'll get better and better and better as you work on it. The worst, would say, possible thing to do is to not work on it and get so stressed out. But so we call it like blank page syndrome. Try to just start somewhere with it. Start with anything is better than nothing and just iterate from there.
Yeah, that was great. And I often talk to people during our consultations or like these hireability sessions, as we call them. And so many people, I just want all of you to know, right, that lots of people get stuck with their portfolios, right? So it's not just you, it's many people have those challenges, right? It's one of the most difficult projects that you'll be working on, right? So it's okay. All right. Thank you so much, Earl. This was awesome. Hope you guys enjoyed the events and got some great insights. So, as promised earlier, right, people often asked about our program. So, again, as I mentioned earlier, let me also quickly tell you about this program that we're running, since it may be a great opportunity for some of you to not just build a very strong real client portfolio and real work experience, but also get the crucial soft skills like team collaboration, client management, and presentation along with career prep to master UX job search and interviewing so you can actually land a UX role. So who the program is best for? The program is the best fit for ambitious people who know UX basics or come from a design, research, creative, tech, or related background and look to transition into UX in one of the most effective and efficient ways and without quitting their current jobs or other commitments they may have. We're also pretty selective and we'll look for motivated and committed team players. So what's BeginX? It's basically a part-time UX career accelerator program with real mission-driven client projects designed to help people transition into UX. We ran many cohorts and helped about 160 people or so transition into UX. Alumni of the program have been hired by companies like SiriusXM, Coach, Google, ABC News, Meta, JP Morgan, many more. So the program was ranked by SwitchUp as a best UX program and also featured in Fortune magazine and on ADP list. The advisors and mentors are also UX practitioners from companies like Google, IDEO, American Express, The Economist, and quite a few others. What you gain after completing the program is build not just the hard skills, but the crucial softer skills, real experience with a robust portfolio, expand your professional network and master UX job search and interviewing so you can actually land a UX role. In fact, our grads have done so well that we offer a money-back guarantee. So you either land a UX job or get your tuition back, plus an extra $500 on top of that. If it sounds like you may be a good candidate, you can learn more on beginx.com, and Mika is going to share the link in the chat, and we'll keep it open for a bit. The next cohort is starting quite soon, so on January 28th. Our cohorts are quite small and fill up quickly, so please act soon. Otherwise, even if you're a great candidate, you may still end up on the wait list. We actually often have that. Also, to thank everyone in our community who attended this event, you'll be eligible for a $500 tuition credit if accepted. To claim that credit, what you need to do is by tomorrow, go to the website or use the link in the chat and request a free, no commitment career transition consultation where we'll do your first UX job hireability assessment, right? And identify your potential roadblocks in this transition. You can also request program info or just apply. And by the way, these consultation sessions, right, they're designed not to just be some like quick program pitch or something like that, right? They're designed to do the following. Take a look at your background, skills, and experience. Identify what is possible for you to do to become a highly hireable UX job candidate. Uncover the key bottlenecks restricting your UX career transition progress. Create a personalized action plan that will get you the results. And also see if you may be a good fit for our UX Career Accelerator program. Okay. So in addition to telling you about the program, I also wanted to briefly mention that we frequently run different types of virtual events. So we will keep you updated about our upcoming events and share resources via our newsletter that is sent every couple of weeks or so, sometimes more frequently, sometimes less. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to our wonderful guest for taking the time to join us and provide all these valuable insights. It was a huge pleasure to have you here, Earl. So, and by the way, Earl, what is the best way for folks who would like to connect to find you?
uxmentor.net. I'm going to post the URL here so that everybody has it. There's a really quick contact form there. So feel free to just shoot me a message, say hello, let me know if you're interested in mentorship, and we can start with an introductory call where I would go through what mentorship looks like and how hopefully I can help you.
All right, awesome. So thank you once again, and we'll see you guys at the next event. Thank you, Earl. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for having me again. Bye, everybody. Good to see you.